Hey, welcome back to Swedenborgian Life. Today we're going to be looking at the question, does it hurt to die? And we're going to be covering these topics. What do life-threatening situations feel like? The hurricane theory in a first-person account. So as the saying goes, I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. And so death is one of the central objects for human fear. But I found that there are sort of two separate conversations around that fear. There's the fear of an undesirable state after death, or the fear of non-existence after death. But then there's also the fear of the actual process of dying. Even among people who believe in a happy afterlife, many express an acute fear of death itself. How will it happen to me? Will it hurt? And beyond that, we wonder about those we love who have died. Did they suffer? Did they feel alone? Also, there's the thought about violent or traumatic deaths. How could something so horrible happen? What if it happened to me? Death is something that we will all go through, and so will everyone we know. So it makes sense that we'd want to know more. But is death as bad as it looks? Even in violent situations, do people really suffer like they seem to? Stay tuned. All right, it's great to have you with us again for another episode of Swedenborgian Life. This is a one that I've been looking forward to for a while, so hope you're enjoying yourself. My name is Curtis, and I'm with the Swedenborg Foundation. It's a nonprofit group that's trying to get conversation around ideas that Swedenborg discussed, such as life after death and the dying process. My guest today is Tom Rose, who is both been an ambulance chief operations officer, a certified crisis chaplain, and many other things, which we'll get into. Tom, thanks so much for hanging out with us today.
Thanks for letting me be here.
All right, it's great to have you. And what I'm going to say that I got to remember that I didn't remember last time was questions. Even before we launch into our topic, if you guys have questions that you want to ask Tom or I about the subject or about anything else, just write them in the comment section, and we'll get to them in the second half when we get to questions, either on YouTube or write them back on Facebook where you found it, and we'll get to those. All right, so let's move on to our first topic for discussion. Segment 1 is, what do life-threatening situations feel like? And so that's something that crosses a lot of people's mind, I would imagine, is sort of these really intense situations, trauma, death, that kind of thing. And Tom, you've actually had a decent amount of experience around those kind of things in several roles. So you do want to just open by talking a little bit about your experience around, traumatic events.
Yeah, well, in the mid to late 70s, I was the chief operations officer of an ambulance, basic life support ambulance, not advanced life support like you have now. Mm-hmm. Most ambulances, paramedics. But back then, there were some of those, but locally, volunteer, basic life support ambulance. And I got out of the Air Force. I was an EMT, and I was asked to be the officer. So we ran enough calls per year that I saw a lot of death, a lot of suffering. And over the years of doing that, I came to realize there's something about people suffering that isn't quite what we think it is.
Yeah, so that, and I want to get to that more in a little bit. And you also, I saw that you were part of a crisis team that was deployed shortly after September 11th.
Yeah,
in New York.
So I took training in what's called critical incident stress management. It's peer counseling. Mm-hmm. So for firefighters, first responders, you take this training and you become a counselor. So you take them through a debriefing. People who on a police department, fire department, ambulance corps, they see horrific things.
Right.
And so this thing was developed where their peers were trained to counsel them, take them through it. So they would develop teams. So I became a member of a county team here, and we would be called, like a fire company saw some horrific thing. Before they even went home, they'd go back to the station, the county team would come in, debrief them. You've seen something horrible, and you're going to experience horrific dreams or whatever you're going to do. You self-medicate. These things are measured and understood, so this is what's happening to you. So as part of this county team, several different teams from around the country were deployed. It was actually October 11th, 2001, we stood at ground zero looking at this scene, and it was
Yeah.
incredible. So we were there to counsel firefighters and
And
police
so
officers.
kind of like, third ring removed, that these are people who saw death, and now you're counseling them to help them move through it. So so you had a lot of experience with people who had been around death and been around it yourself, and I want to take a look at, so you said you had some interesting observations about suffering in the greatest theater of suffering, these traumatic events and death. And I want to first pull up a quote from Swedenborg, who had a lot of experience around sort of the spiritual and life after death and that kind of thing. And he says he was describing actually the process of, he was shown what it was like to die. He was saying, I was brought into a state in which my physical senses were inoperative, very much then like the state of people who are dying. And I thought that was interesting. Physical senses aren't operative. And you were telling me before that you had seen that people who are going through these really traumatic events aren't always experiencing them like we think they are, right?
Right. It's interesting how Swedenborg in that place, in Heaven and Hell, says, like people when people are dying, as if we all know that your physical senses go away when you're dying.
When you're dying,
You've
done it before.
And I haven't talked to people who died.
Yes.
But I have noticed over the years, back then and since, if somebody goes through a severe traumatic event, and I'm not talking broke a finger,
right,
or a
car accident.
I'm talking about a car accident. Steering wheel goes through their chest, and they're screaming at the scene. Everybody's looking at there's a lot of blood, and then it's just horrific, and people are very upset around it, and then in the hospital, you ask the person, they wake up and they say, what happened? You say, what do you remember? Nothing. So I found that there's a question that I'd started asking people appropriately. I didn't ask everybody we treated on the ambulance, but
Sure.
I mean, people I knew who went through something. And later I became a pastor, and I was visiting people who were recovering from something. I would say, what do you remember of the worst of it when it was severe trauma? And there are only two answers to that question.
And everyone that you talked to?
Everyone I talked to.
Yeah.
There's only two answers. One was, I don't remember. Most people said, I don't remember. And very few start telling you something else, like a spiritual experience, or I was near-death experience, out-of-body, life review, or slow motion, but that's not what people saw. So they're telling you something other than what everybody witnessed. But no one could say what it felt like for a steering wheel to go through their chest.
Because you hadn't talked to anyone who was like, oh yeah, it was.
Oh, it was just like, exactly like this. No, they're describing something else.
Yeah, so that brings it. Let's bring up the next Swedenborg quote, which seems very. The light of reason is overshadowed by our mistaken ideas, which arise because we trust what our outer physical senses tell us. And so I just wanted to pull that one in because I thought of when you're talking about, okay, people, first responders, other people who are around see this, what looks like horrific suffering. Even someone can be responding and screaming or something. You think, oh, this person must be in unimaginable suffering. But when you're interviewing these people, consistently, they're saying, no, I wasn't there.
That's my experience.
Yeah.
The consistent answer seems to be, I don't remember what happened. And I'm not going to be a person who tries to take them through it. Well, think about it. Try harder.
Yeah.
I'm not going to. I'm just going to accept their answer. They didn't consciously experience what happened. At least, subsequently, they don't think they did. They can't tell me about it.
Yeah.
Or this other experience.
Yeah, and so that brings us up to our second topic for discussion, which I labeled the hurricane theory, which is something that I came across through you. But the idea that if really in trauma, these kinds of horrific experiences, the person who's going through them isn't there either. They just don't remember it, or they had some kind of spiritual experience. And you just go to any near-death experience, and they say, "Oh, I was floating above," or I felt a sense of peace, a sense of light, that kind of thing. So if they're not there, obviously there is damage being done. But the hurricane theory, if you want to talk about it a bit, is the idea that the real suffering is happening not with the person, but with those who care about the person. So
my theory around this severe, swirling storm of severe trauma, the hurricane thing, is, emotional trauma, emotional suffering seems to me to be more intense around what we would call the victim of trauma. I like to say the subject of the trauma, but we don't have that in our vocabulary. We say
Sure.
the victim of trauma. So the person in the middle is in this curious calm that we talked about.
Yeah.
What, you know,
And a lot of
so-
people will, after they've had their near-death experience or some kind of traumatic experience, will say, I no longer fear the dying process.
That often happens.
Yeah.
And yet there is something happened. They went through severe trauma. They
Yeah.
might have lost a leg. I mean, something happened. There's a storm.
Yes.
Something happened. But they're in this place in the middle that's curiously calm.
Mm-hmm.
And the people around, especially closest to them, are in the swirl of emotion around it. And they're picturing, mom heard about the accident and or brother heard about it, was going to be the one that picked him up and didn't, and someone else did. And they thought, if only I'd been there.
Oh, yes.
And they're going through all these,
Right.
so many I could tell you about, emotional anguish over, I wish I would, and what could I have done? But also they're picturing what they went through. So how could anybody suffer that kind of pain? A steering wheel through
Yeah.
your chest? How could God permit such suffering? But they just have to ask their loved one, what's it? Oh, you must have suffered so, and they're starting to get that everybody else is so upset around them, and they're upset. Their life has changed. Something's happened.
And
they're now they're almost having to caretake all their loved ones who are they're picturing what they went through and they didn't experience that.
Yeah, I think that people will report, once you're in the hospital, pain can come back. Obviously you have a recovery period,
right.
but as to your point, the actual event itself that's causing all this anguish in everyone, the moment itself, that they were in some kind of eye,
There was in some kind of curious calm, and but the swirling stuff around it, even busyness around it, you can picture lots of things being the wind, all the people caring for them, that's all normal, but all this swirl of emotion around it. And the reason I want to talk about this is, when they wake up in the hospital and say, they might wake up and see mom in the chair in the corner weeping, and they wake up and say, what happened?
Right.
And that's I think a cue for mom to go, maybe they don't, I'm picturing stuff that didn't happen. And I also feel as though, therefore, people who are around someone who went through severe trauma, I encourage them to think like this. They didn't experience quite what we think they did. Let's stop picturing that. Let's stop going back and saying, oh, that must have been, and then picture all these things.
Right.
Let's just be where they are now and help them move forward.
Yeah, that there can actually be a more effective way to move through.
Move through it. Let's get this, let's calm the winds. We keep being emotional about what happened to them and what they felt. They didn't feel that. The evidence is they didn't feel what we think they felt. And let's get where they are now, which is, what are we going to do now? And I also feel in terms of dying, let's say they didn't wake up in the hospital. I believe in the afterlife, and I believe they wake up somewhere else and go, what happened? I don't think they felt it either way, the same way we think they did.
Same kind of principle. Right. And let's, and this all, before you were ambulance driver or a pastor or anything like that, you actually had an experience that kind of cued you into this whole, there's another reality. And so let's get to our third segment where we can hear a little bit about that. So I called this a first person account because I remember you talking about that long before you'd gotten into any of this, you had sort of this peek in, and I had a little Swedenborg quote to kick it off, which is, I wasn't able to feel, this is from his same report of his own experience, I wasn't able to perceive and even feel that there was a pull, a kind of drawing out of the deeper levels of my mind and therefore of my spirit from my body. And this is what we've been talking about the whole time, that the body is what's going through these traumas, that the spirit is something else. So I was just wondering if you would be willing to talk us through a little bit what happened to you.
So what happened to me, I was 14 years old at midnight at a lake with my two friends, Kevin and Edward, and they were swimming. I wasn't a swimmer.
Yeah.
And I had learned something about swimming, so I decided when they came up on the rocks of the rocky shoreline, I decided to show off. We're 14.
Yeah.
I decided, like an idiot, to dive in the water and show them what I could do. And I swam pretty well, but I got out to a certain point, couldn't turn around, whatever was happening, and I went down. And it's still the most helpless feeling I've ever experienced. I'm sinking down, it's dark, I hate water, and I'm My mind is calling out to God, help me. I'm just totally helpless. At a certain point, they realized what was happening, came in after me to get me. From beginning to end, for my friends, that was a serious traumatic event, an emotional, an emergency. They came in, they ended up saving my life, getting me on shore. I ended up coughing up water. We're lying there silent for a half an hour. But for me, at a certain point, all of a sudden I was watching a movie of my life. Today it's called a life review.
Right.
And so
this was a long time ago.
I was 14. It's 1967.
Before Raymond Moody or any of that.
It's 8 years before Raymond Moody published Life After Life. So for those 8 years, I'm thinking nobody else has experienced this.
Yeah.
So I didn't talk about it to anybody.
Right.
That's until I started reading other people have experienced this. But I was watching a feature-length movie of my life. All peaceful scenes on my life. Wonderful feature-length movie. Peace, 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 peace. And then I was suddenly above the lake, 30 feet up where the cabins were. It's midnight. It's chilly. I see the people in the cabin. I'm, hello. I see my uncle, who I called uncle.
Yeah.
Hello. Trying to get their attention about what's happening. It's a very real experience to me.
Sensory, like tactile.
And that's called an out-of-body experience. So I didn't have the full NDE, but I had this life review and I had this out-of-body, and I was totally, as far as I was concerned, that's where I was, trying to get their attention. And then I was coughing up water on the shore. And, from then on, 14 years old on, I realized our life is not just this. There's some other thing going on. There's another level of consciousness. And as I said, my friends had a traumatic, horrific experience from beginning to end. If you had interviewed me right then, I would have told you, well, I had something scary and traumatic and then a wonderful, peaceful experience.
Yeah,
and if you
turned out to be a pretty good night.
It was like the most peaceful thing I've ever felt.
Yeah.
And if you kept talking to me and looked upset about what happened, I would have tried to comfort you and say, it's okay, everything's going to be all right. Because I just knew that then.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. I mean, I really appreciate you being willing to share this story here, and I think hearing about that kind of thing is just because this is, a lot of people go through these kinds of things, and so just to hear a little more about it, because it's not always talked about, is really cool. So I appreciate that. We're going to take a quick break and then get to some questions if you guys have any. So we'll be back with more with Tom in a minute. All right, we're back. We played 2 videos in a row, so you guys got a sneak peek of the next one, but you won't get the full one till our next segment. We're back with Tom Rose, who we've been talking to about the question, does it hurt to die? And Tom's been just finished telling us his what we'd now call a near-death experience, and we've learned some from what he'd experienced working around trauma and grief and all that. So we want to take questions or comments from any of you out there who have any thoughts on it. So let's get to our first one now. This is from Chris on Facebook. I know a true story in which a murder victim came back in a dream to assure her friend that she did not suffer during those last moments before she died. That even during the murder, the victim's experience was being transformed by God into dazzling, rainbow-flashing jewels. Have you heard any stories like this? So, Chris, thank you very much for sharing that. So that's a whole other dimension to this thing. That it's not just like, oh, this is a horrific accident. This is murder. This is there's this sort of evil happening there. And yet even there can be this kind of lightness. Have you heard of any people who are being attacked and had experiences like that?
Well, I've certainly heard stories like that where there's somehow somebody feels reassured after somebody passed away. Not necessarily in case of murder, but I was actually, I'll just tell you a quick one.
Sure.
I was experiencing a tough situation where I was being held up at gunpoint. It's just him and me in a room, and I'm being held up, and this was very traumatic without being physically, violent. But it was horrific for me, and all of a sudden my thoughts were I had a bazillion million thoughts about my life. It wasn't exactly the same as that drowning thing, but in those moments that this was happening, I was experiencing what was the, let's see, I'm picturing my wife and my children and, all my loved ones, and while I'm looking at this person. And so I was starting to be, as far as I'm concerned, cared for.
Yeah. Thank you again. You have some very good stories. And so we have another element there of, that no matter what kind of trauma it is, there is this care in it. So thanks very much, Chris. Let's get to our next one. This is Karen on Facebook. How would you know unless you experienced it? From watching a few die, I believe it is not peaceful. What is your take on that? So, I think that all we can really know is what is experience and reporting, because we don't yet have the technology to, somehow, here you can plug you in and feel exactly what this person is feeling. It seems to me, Tom, that we're talking about specific traumatic events. Like this is a violent event rather than, if somebody has a long drawn out battle with cancer or something like that. Is that accurate, that there's sort of a difference there?
Yeah. And there's lots of levels of trauma. There's lots of processes of dying. So it's complex, and we can't get in there. So what I've been trying to say is, what I've witnessed, even with thrashing around, is that they're not experiencing what it looks like they're experiencing. It looks like it's bad. And as a pastor later, having this theory for years, I was standing with someone, visiting them in the hospital because their husband was ill. We were in the hallway looking through a doorway at the husband thrashing around through some procedure, and I knew what that looked like. And I said, "Can I tell you my theory?" She said, "Yes." "You're going to go back to the room, and even though you're seeing this kind of upset right now, he's not going to remember it. Mm-hmm. And so you don't have to have this image in your mind for very long, because if it's not part of his experience, you don't have to worry about it." So she could take out of her mind this appearance of tremendous suffering, and sure enough, later on, he didn't remember that.
Yeah, so there you go. And I know that a lot of near-death experiences, people who have out-of-body experiences, will see their body and see it being operated on, or see it in the crash, and they're like, it's there, and it's a physical machine, so it can still be responding and reacting, but yet the consciousness, the person that we're worried about isn't necessarily experiencing. So thanks very much for that one, Karen. And now we're going to take a look at a third question. Fuzzman57 Gaming on YouTube. Is it possible once you're in the afterlife to meet the souls of your pets, or will they be separate from where we are? That's a great question, because I do feel like it'd be fun to see my dog. I have heard a few near-death experiences where people will mention pets. They just, but not an overwhelming number. I would think, this idea that love is Swedenborg has this quote, "Love is our life." That love is what makes life, and that love is, from God, and therefore infinite and eternal. So whatever's there in the pet, it's gotta. It's not just like it will be gone. So those are a few thoughts. Tom, do you have anything to add?
I'm with you. I want to see my pets.
Yeah, man. If I think about it, reunion, everything's okay. Like taking what's lost and bringing it back. These seem to be like really, really high quality feelings, And so if we're talking about afterlife and God, there's got to be some kind of reunion there. So, that's our best guess. Thanks very much for the question. Next one is from Leanne on YouTube. So the consciousness seems removed, but only the body suffers in a trauma. And I know Swedenborg has a direct quote when he says that during physical pain, and I got to paraphrase it a bit, it's not our soul does not suffer, but merely feels discomfort. It's the body that suffers. But so that seems to be what he was saying, and it seems also to be what you were saying, that it's the body is what's going through it, but the consciousness or the spirit is removed in some way.
I think even people who aren't thinking about the afterlife or God or comfort or anything like that might be willing to agree that during traumatic time, you hear stories about people who, even if it's not severe trauma, they got a covenant in their head, they don't know it till they feel, oh, it's wet. So
Yep.
there's some kind of even mechanical something that takes our conscious suffering a little bit away from, and we might be looking at a crooked arm going, well, it's called shock, and go, oh, I broke my arm.
Yes.
Not that it's always like that. There is pain in the world. I'm not saying there isn't, but there's a certain removal from it. There's steps of removal from what's happening to the body. So yes, the body experiences it, but then there's something in the brain that takes steps away from it, and I would say, and the spirit.
Yeah, and there's sort of these levels of removal that go depending on the nature of the injury or anything.
Yeah.
But, so anyway, hopefully that adds something to your question. All right, we have more. Amanda on YouTube. Do you think that the consciousness merges with God's, and so our own identity is momentarily lost? That's an interesting thought on it. And you definitely will get in people's recorded near-death experiences that they'll have moments of, it's all one, we're all one. Also, people who will see their bodies in out-of-body experiences and say, oh yeah, that, what's his name? George Ritchie, who wrote A Return from Tomorrow or something, that one of the first major near-death experiences published, that he was out of body going through the barracks where he was, and he was trying to find his body, and he was looking, and he finally recognized himself because of the ring he had on. Like he was like, oh, is that me? Is that so? That is there this kind of removal into the consciousness of God, or this greater sort of heavenly consciousness? Do you have anything to add?
Sure, maybe. When I was having my life review, all these peaceful scenes out of my life that took 2 hours as far as I was concerned, they were from a perspective sort of above and looking down at, oh, there's me playing my same favorite game when I was 2. Oh, there's me doing it. I'm thinking, whose perspective was that?
Whose camera is that?
Whose perspective am I given to experience? So that wasn't my perspective. So
Right.
I think we're allowed to see, you're seeing the perspective of a guardian angel or God, or however you want to look at it. It wasn't my perspective.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, do we have another one? Okay, we're going to take one from Natalie on YouTube. Did you notice being more sensitive to spiritual things after the near drowning, like seeing or hearing things? So, Tom, this is for you. Did that have lasting ripples in your life?
It's interesting. Not in terms of noticing paranormal things or something like that.
Yeah.
Not like that. Not being tuned into the other world in terms of seeing things, but definitely tuned into the fact that there's another dimension of our life and our reality, what we're living. I think having that experience and knowing we're much more than our body led me perhaps to run on an ambulance in a fire company and, do that kind of work, become a crisis counselor and be a pastor. I think I've been trying to save people from spiritually drowning ever since.
Yeah.
So I had a perspective that enriched my life. And very often you can find people who talk about the tragedy in their life became a turning point, and that it could, if they let it, enrich their life because they could help others through it.
Yeah, and that's a whole other conversation, but I remember hearing about this study recently where they monitored lottery winners and people who had went through a major trauma 3 years later, and the trauma people were happier
Yes.
in general. And that of course Swedenborg spends a lot of time talking about how the hard things we go through can lead to this positive growth, and we see that kind of in example in your story. So we have another question to get to. All right, this is from Fuzzman57 Gaming again. In the afterlife, are there also drugs that bring you into even deeper planes of existence as there are on ours? So I don't know. Swedenborg says that everything you find here, you find there. But I don't know. There's certainly, he talks about progressively deeper levels of experience and consciousness. He never talks about substances to get you there. It's more about linking up with people who are of that mind, or opening yourself to various inflows. But my answer is I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Only this one, which is Swedenborg talks about, and we don't get into this a lot, but it's there a lot with Swedenborg, is when we die and go to the other world, we don't go right to heaven or right to hell. Some maybe do. But we go to this place called the world of spirits, as opposed to the spiritual world, which encompasses them all.
Sure.
We go to the world of spirits, and we spend time there, processing our stuff. If we're not done here, we have to finish. And if we like to do drugs, we're going to do drugs.
Similar life.
Whatever that form that takes, we're going to be in a life there where someone is helping us through that and saying, you don't need this, you don't need to do that. And does it really take you to some real deeper level of consciousness, or is it really altering reality? And maybe somebody would be there to help us realize this isn't helping my actual reality. Reality is much better than this.
Sure. So all kinds of learning the root of things and what leads to what. Yeah.
So are there drugs in the other world? I think there's stuff that we do like that until we're in heaven or hell.
Yeah. And then continuing as far as the deeper states thing, you'll get to deeper states.
You'll get deeper states.
Swedenborg says every state we get to is like an egg to the next state. That it's just nothing. You haven't seen anything yet. So all right. I think that we're gonna have to cut it off there because we're running out of time here. So we're gonna come back and do a quick little meditation type exercise, and I hope to see you then. We'll take a little video break. All right, we're here, and one last question flashed up on the screen there before the video, so I think we want to take a look at that one. So this is from, because I feel bad if people take the time to ask questions, we don't have the time to get to them, so let's do this. Mark on YouTube, all NDEs are experienced by people who have a functioning brain. So are NDEs relevant evidence that consciousness continues after the brain function ceases? So I think I just was looking at a study about this done by Sam Parnia. Have you heard about that in the UK? About people and where they interviewed cardiac arrest patients, like a sample of like 2,000, and said, have you had an experience? When did you? And it was just hard to work with sample size or whatever. But they did find a guy they were talking to who was able to accurately report these beeps on a machine that happen every 3 minutes or whatever. So there's sort of this debate that goes on, because obviously people who lose brain function for a period of time can come back and have NDEs, but are they having them as the brain fires back up, or are they having them while they're gone? That's a debate for another time. But did you have any thoughts sort of on that?
Same thing.
Process?
It's hot in the news right now.
Yeah.
That they measured this person, and they said they could tell how long the brain function was out, and that person could they could see. They're measuring things every so many minutes. They can tell that thing beeped, and they can say what was happening in the room at the time. They're actually saying that the evidence that they see from this is there's consciousness beyond brain function, brain waves. And so, but in my experience, when I was drowning, let's say, my brain had nothing to do in one sense with my experience. It was so far beyond the brain and its capabilities. I was experiencing something of the spirit that lasted, as far as I knew, for 2 hours, and it really only lasted for a few seconds.
No time or space.
No time or space. So, did it have to do with my brain functioning? It's kind of irrelevant to me. That the experience is irrelevant to that. Maybe I just don't know. I don't think it needs the natural brain.
Yeah, very good. All right, so thanks everybody for your questions, and if you're watching this afterwards, feel free to write one down, and we'll try to get to it during the week. All right, so we're going to close with sort of a more emotive process. We call this Correspondences. We do it every week, and the idea is that Swedenborg, who had all these spiritual experiences of his own, would write about sort of the symbolism in objects. He would say, what we see in the physical world is actually, images of the deeper spiritual kind of realities or roots of life. And so today we're going to talk about leaves. It's in the northern hemisphere. Fall is hitting its stride. So we want to think about these things that are popping into all these colors and what does it mean. And this is kind of a little inference, since he doesn't really ever describe fall leaves as far as I know, but he talks about leaves as truths or knowledges in the mind. That the tree is like a mind, and the leaves are the things that we know. And I was thinking about fall, and this is kind of this clearing out, and I wonder if it's akin to points in our lives when, we get sort of our old ideas are pushed out to make room for the new growth next spring. So I don't want to pigeonhole it too much. You guys see what you get out of it, but just be thinking of this idea of renewal and the ideas in the mind as we look at these images of leaves for like 45 seconds. And the idea is that if you're looking at this symbol of it, you can get sort of a connection and an insight there into the reality behind it. So just take a look and relax. So fall is when my birthday is. So obviously it was my favorite season when I was young. So I continue associations with it. And so during the break, Tom, you were mentioning that Swedenborg does discuss seasons and discusses autumn. So do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, just the 4 seasons of our life. And we do just naturally tend to talk about the autumn years of our life, in terms of old age, and because we see change and things passing, dying, and then winter is sort of like death.
Yeah.
and I had a birthday in autumn too, so
there you go.
So it's cool. But I look at it as a beautiful. I think that it's really interesting how in nature God has presented dying in such a beautiful, magnificent, theater, so that we can. I think it's a clue to, it's really it's all good, because that's just a transition.
Oh, that's a perfect tie-in to our theme today that I never thought of. That you have the fall is this death of a lot of stuff, but yet it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
That wait a second, maybe it's not as bad as we think. All right. So if you guys enjoyed this program, hopefully so, you can help support it. Swedenborg Foundation is a nonprofit. You just click the link in the description. You can make a small PayPal donation to help it keep going and reach other people. And Tom, it's been really awesome having you here, man. I appreciate hearing about your experience and things you've been through and your insights from that. And we hope to have you back someday.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and I hope you guys can all tune in. Next week, we'll be back, same place, same time.